Right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the NFM Lunch and Learn. We've got Ollie from, the Wetland Charity, WWT, today to present to us really valuable insights on the NFM and the RFCC funding phase 2. I will pass it on to Ollie. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks to Thames River Trust for letting me present, and particularly to you, Sarah, for your organisation. My name's Ollie Etherington. I work for the Wildfowl Wetlands Trust currently. Previously, well, in a former life, I was an emergency responder chemist, but about 7 years ago, I went back to study geographical information systems and remote sensing. Since then, I've worked for Five Rivers doing habitat restoration design, river restorations, mainly chalk streams. And after that, I went to work for FWAG Southwest. I wasn't a farm advisor. I did learn a bit about farming while I was there, but I was specifically helping with NFM. Now I work for the Wildfowl Wetlands Trust, and I exclusively support the Thames Regional Flood and Coastal Committee with their small to medium scale levy funding grant that they've got going on. I give you all that context just to say where I'm coming from. I tend to be a bit more mapping based and technical, I suppose, but also I mean, I've got a bit of experience, but very much consider myself to still be learning. And I'm aware that a lot of people on this call probably have more experience than me. So my aim is really to share the grant funding, give a bit more information about that to help you with that if you're interested in pursuing an application, and then also to follow up with just some bits and pieces about NFM opportunity mapping that I've found helpful, and hopefully you will as well. But if anyone has any comments or context that they think is useful that they'd like to add, or if you think if you have a criticism as well, don't be shy, that's fine. I'm happy to learn and foster conversation as it goes. So the RFCC's levy funding pot, they've put together this proposal. It started a few years back now. This is just the recent window of grant funding, and it might well be the last with the changes that are happening to government funding. But the idea behind it was to provide something that was a bit more accessible and with lower barriers to entry than the usual grant and aid scheme. So as a result of that, the funding pot is smaller, but the things that you are required to do for the application are less. For instance, significantly, there's no requirement for a business case. So there's the funding pot for capital works and closely associated elements for projects, but then also there's me as an NFM advisor, and the TFAs also offer support and experience. So lots of people happy to help and advise, as well as trying to get the actual grant applications through. So the current funding window, oh, sorry, this is just a continuation of some of the things I've said. So for smaller schemes and all the way across the Thames catchment, the maximum grant contribution from the RFCC is 50,000, but this can be match funded. If it's non-central governmental, non-treasury money, it can be match funded up to 500,000. But the element that comes from central government, so for instance, if there's WEF money included, the total limit on that is 100,000, including this 50,000 from the RFCC. It can cover, it's mainly for capital funding, but it can also cover slight elements of project management and detailed design in proportion to the project scale and the funding amount. And also, there has to be there's a reasonable expectation that the risk of it not going ahead is very low. So speculative scoping work is really outside of the remit of the funding, but smaller elements that just might inform the detailed design have been accepted as being funded through this grant scheme. One complicated factor is that all of the applications do have to come through the lead local flood authority, so the local authority. A lot of them are really engaged with it. Obviously, some of them have restrictions on their resources and how much time they can take. But a common comment from the LFAs is that even where they are under pressure and they don't have a lot of time, if the application is sufficiently put together when it comes to them and they just sort of have to review it, then a lot of the time they're a bit more open than if they have to be quite involved in helping to put it together. And I myself, I can help to support putting the applications together and reviewing them. And also the TFAs have a lot of advice and experience that they can offer in supporting with that as well. There is the expectation for a certain amount of monitoring and feedback. It's quite minimal, but the more you can do, the better it would support your application. I mentioned that this one might be the last funding window, partly because of the changes in government's funding that they've proposed, but also because there's the discrete end of the project is September 2027. So even if we do have some money left over in the pot, it would be it's getting a bit difficult, I suppose, to ensure that you'd have enough time to be able to deliver the project. But I suppose that'll be something that we'll have to review and might be open to some discussion if we do have money left over after this window, but we'll have to see. The application has a Word document element and an Excel spreadsheet element. I'm happy to share them along with this slide after the presentation. As part of this funding window and the previous one, the RFCC have identified areas that they think are particularly in need of attention for natural flood management projects, and these are them. This doesn't mean that these are the only places they're looking at, but I think there'd be a lot of willingness to try and support projects from these areas in particular if you have anything that comes up here. This is an overview of the process, which is perhaps a little involved, but I'll leave it in the presentation for reference. If you have any questions about this, it's probably, feel free to come to me, but I'll probably put you in touch with the flood advisors at the RFCC, because they have a better idea of all of their funding portals and processes. And the general email address is down the bottom there if you have any questions for them about this or anything else. These are the key dates. So the window is currently open. It will be open until the 5th of June. But then there's a panel that will review the applications between June and August, and the decisions will come September 2026. So as I pointed out, then there's only a year to get them completed, which certainly is not impossible, but it doesn't leave a lot of leeway for risks and so on, obviously. So I thought it'd be helpful to pick out a few of the things that people seem to have, well, not necessarily struggled in the applications, but things that have maybe been a little bit thin. So the first thing is, it's a bit frustrating, but the requirement for the funding, which is laid out in sort of the RFCC's established policies, which hopefully may be changing, but as it is at the minute, for their funding for this pot, they want to see that the project has a fairly localized flood mitigation benefit to residential properties. So that's less thinking about general catchment scale contributions to flood reduction and more having to identify a specific hotspot that you're seeking to address. So they do have some mapping that includes key flood risk hotspots that you can review. And I've got the links to access the mapping that I can share as well. But it doesn't have to just be from that. You can also look to your local records, look through the flooding investigation reports for the local area to sort of build up a case for why it would be beneficial in the location that it is. And of course, also the various government data sources for flood risk and flooding as well, that there's a link to there. The second one, in contrast to that, is, which I imagine among this audience, hopefully wouldn't be less of an issue, but they do like to see that people are being considerate of the catchment-based approach and looking to the catchment improvement plans, and ideally as well, engaging with the partnerships to make sure that the projects are designed and placed in a way that is compatible with the other works that are going on and the wider requirements in the catchment. Stakeholder engagement is understandable, I suppose, because a lot of the time there just isn't the resourcing all the time. People are trying to rush and put together the applications, but the more people that you can talk to, the better. Especially, it's really good to see from early on in the design process. So when you're even looking at the conceptual design, have you engaged with the local residents and the community groups to see what is compatible and what is desirous and what will fit in with what other NGOs might have going on and things like that. So this sort of builds up a reassurance in the design and the proposal you have, but also reduces the risk going forward. If you can get buy-in and agreement, then it lends credibility to the idea that you've got a project that's going to be successful and go ahead. By the same stroke, permissions and licenses are often overlooked, which is unfortunate because some of these things then, if you're not aware of them, can take quite a bit of time and might impact on the ability to deliver. So it's worth just considering. I mean, obviously the ones that are readily apparent are the landowner agreement and things like that. And I think most people are aware of the needs for land drainage consent, flood risk activity permitting, but also things like waste exemption licenses if you're going to be excavating spoil, and even if you're using it on site or in the design, there's a requirement there for an exemption license for that. And then things like utilities and infrastructure, if you have assets that you need approval for. Planning permission does seem to often be overlooked, which again is understandable because it can be quite difficult to get a clear impression from the planning department without starting through the process or spending money. And then for certain projects, things like impoundment. Yeah, that's not an exhaustive list, but just some of the things that have come up that people have not considered prior to the application. I wouldn't say that if you haven't considered it, it will write off the application or anything like that. It's just nice to see that there's a plan in place and a reassurance that things will proceed smoothly, which sort of leads into the risk management. So the requirements for the application are not as stringent as the grant in aid or other funding pots. So they're not asking for detailed modelling or really technical analysis or anything like that. It's more about taking a risk-based approach and making sure that you're covering yourself for all the things that can happen, and also what the potential risks of the design might be in operation or failure, and just thinking about how to mitigate against this and allow leeway or whatever appropriate actions might be. Maintenance comes up as well. Again, it's not necessarily required to have a fixed plan and agreement in place, although that does look very good. But even just demonstration that you've considered what will be required and the sort of timescales and who will carry it out, I think is a key element of that. Who will be responsible. So moving on from the application bits, some general bits about NFM opportunity finding. As I said at the beginning, these are just things that I've found helpful. So I hope they'll be useful to you as well. I've outlined here just sort of like a general progress of different elements of the design phases. Obviously, some of these are iterative and you go back, but I suppose the things I'd like to pick out are considering the risks and constraints early on and early stakeholder engagement to inform design. I've included here a few guides on monitoring as well. As I mentioned, that's something that tends to be a bit of an afterthought, but yeah, those are just some good guides of like best practice and how to implement monitoring prior to the project as well, which is something that, well, occasionally, yeah, it's unfortunate if monitoring is an afterthought and then you realize that you could have got the data beforehand. But anyway, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with that. So looking at the flooding issues, as I mentioned, like local reports, section 19, flood risk databases, also various flow and rain records. I've got a few links in a minute coming up to places that you can look for information on that. Looking at the flow pathways, so the EA have their ordinary flow pathways, which are very useful to looking at where to best place interventions. On the next slide, I also talk about the minor flow pathways and how you can get those if you're au fait with GIS software. The topography, which you'd need for the minor flow pathways, but also is good for consideration in terms of slope and aspect. Is the slope, well, possibly obvious to everyone here, but generally speaking, the lower slope areas will be better for excavations and water storage because there'll be a lower risk of failure, less necessity for bunds, and the spoil excavated will be lesser, and the excavated spoil quickly mounts up and becomes problematic if you overextend the opportunities that you have for getting rid of it on site and so forth. And obviously, removing it from site is generally prohibitively expensive. Soil type and health are the key considerations. So the clayiness of the soil or how readily the water infiltrates, not just for the movement of water through the catchment and slowing down water, but also for holding water in itself. So there's certain things you can do to improve the soil health in terms of land use or encouraging certain vegetation types and things like that, planting, and general land use considerations for agricultural land. I think this will be on here. So if you are interested in that, you can always go and speak to Frag Southwest if you're in the area. Still plugging in there. This is what I was talking about in terms of minor flow pathways. So you might be familiar with IB. I see your hand up.
Sorry, that was meant to be a wave.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
With the Frag Southwest reference.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, so on the top here, you've got a site with the EA's freely available dataset for ordinary flow pathways. So this is, it's based on the topography. So it does require some ground truthing, both of these do, but it gives you an indication of the pathway that water will take across the land. So then you can decide where to situate things best. This top one, as I said, is the freely available one. This one at the bottom is what I'm calling the minor flow pathways, and you can create these yourself. by using the EA's freely available LiDAR. So there's a link to it here. You will want to download all of the tiles for the catchment that you're looking at, or the sub-catchment, and you can get catchment shape files from the Catchment Data Explorer, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And then you just, and some clarification, because often there's some confusion over which is which or what the difference is. The terrain model shows the ground level, or it aims to show the ground level. Sometimes there are some remaining artifacts in it because it's been passed through a filter to try and remove, say, vegetation or hedgerows and buildings, but the process isn't perfect. So sometimes some elements of that do remain on the terrain model, so that's worth bearing in mind. The surface model includes hedges, trees, and things like that above ground. I tend to use the DTM when I'm looking at the flow pathways, but looking at the digital surface model can also be useful. For instance, if you're aware that the hedges that are crossing your flow pathway are actually quite intact and are going to impede flow, you might want to have a look at the DSM as well as the DTM to inform your design and your placement. So this is just the process. If you're familiar with JS software, this should make sense to you. If not, feel free to reach out to me and I'm happy to show you how to do it. But you get your tiles, you actually need to merge them all together as well, then clip them to the catchment. So you've just got the area you're processing so that you're not using too much processing power and taking ages. It's then necessary to use, so you can get an add-on for QGIS, which is called Saga, or it's also a standalone program. And there's a tool in that allows you to fill the sinks. And that just means that if there's any holes in the data set, they'll be filled in so that the water will continue flowing over them rather than artificially draining away at a point that doesn't exist. You then apply another tool which gives you the Strahler order, which just says how many accumulations that there have been along the flow path journey, so that you can then ascertain from that how big the stream is. So lower numbers, smaller streams, maybe even not sort of visible, higher order, bigger rivers. And then you just use the symbology to, well, the easiest way to do it is just make those lower order ones invisible until you get something like this, which shows you where the minor flow routes are. So if you were looking at this, you might not necessarily, depending on how obvious it is to eye on site, it might not be apparent where you might want to place, say, an attenuation pond. But then if you look at this, you can see, well, maybe you want to put it where a few different pathways come together. Another tool that's really useful on QGIS is the profile tool. It's just called the profile tool. It allows you to put a line across the DTM and see what the terrain is like. And these are some of the useful references that I mentioned. I don't know, I mean, shout if these are all really obvious and everyone already knows this, but I thought that there might be some things of interest here. So I'm going to come out of full screen or not. Oh dear. So this one I don't use for very much, but what it can be useful for is if you have a point and you want to look at what the subcatchment is, you can get an on-the-spot boundary there and it gives you the area. So then if, say, you're looking at the rainfall data or the flow data for a nearby EA gauging station, you can just take a rough ratio of that catchment and that data to this size. Obviously, that's very rough and ready and makes a lot of assumptions about whether the catchment is the same and so on, but it can give you a starting idea to carry on with. Another useful one that I found some people aren't aware of is the the Hydrology Data Explorer. So you can see from here that you've got all of your gauging stations split out by level and flow and rainfall. And then you can also access the full data sets. And whereas on the river flow archive, the rainfall is 15-minute intervals, I think on this you can download it to the 5-minute ones. So that's very handy. This is the aforementioned river flow archive, which is still very useful. I'll pick a random one. So you can see on here, whoops, wrong one. Oh, this wasn't a very good one to pick, but so you get the flow duration curves and all of the quotients for that gauging station, and then variable amounts of information on the catchment itself. So that's very useful. I imagine everyone's probably familiar with Magic, but I thought it would be incomplete not to mention this, because it includes so many useful data sets, especially for land type, priority habitats, but also access designations, including the statutory ones and historic elements. So that's well worth looking at. BGS seems to be one that a lot of people aren't so aware of. The data sets in here that I find particularly useful are superficial deposits for looking at peat rather than the peat data set, because that actually is a commercial thing. But also, if you look at, is it that one? The borehole records. So obviously this is dependent on there being a suitable one near to your project location, but you can look at the information of the actual survey that's been done, which can be very helpful if there is one locally to see what's going on, below the surface, including, where the aquifer is or what the layers are, all of that. This one, I think people are generally more aware of. That's the Soilscapes viewer, which gives you sort of, it's not very fine resolution, but it can be handy to just look at the general soil type. This one is my favorite website, I think. So I use this to look at old OS maps for areas, which, as you see here, so we're looking, this is just outside of Cirencester. This is an old water meadow here, and we can see where all the pathways were. It can be useful to know where things will work. So, for instance, was there a ghost pond at some point that gives an indication that it might be a good feature? Or can you reinstate water meadow elements? It can also help to understand why the flow paths are the way they are, and what's going on at site. The most useful layers, I think, are county layers. This one, if you're in Southwest England, is great, or this 25-inch one. So yeah, just a few useful. Oh, and of course, WWT's Wetland Explorer. One of the best things about this one is it has some layers which I think were done by the Rivers Trust. So they might also be available on a Rivers Trust map. I'm not sure if it loads. Yeah, that tends to take a while. But in one of the layers, there is some for connectivity of habitat, which I find particularly useful, and I haven't really found elsewhere. I think that'll be under nature recovery, perhaps. habitat networks. That's the one. So oh, it's quite slow. Well, the link's in the presentation anyway, so you can have a look at that at your leisure if you fancy. Thames RFCC also have their own opportunity mapping. It was automatically generated based on data sets, so it's not a hard and fast, this is what should actually happen here, but it can be a good starting point. And the RFCC do like to see that you've considered it in applications as well. And it includes, like I say, these hotspots for flooding, which can be useful to bolster your application. So yeah, I'll share this presentation. As I said, you do have to access the SharePoint and have permission to look at the mapping, but these are the links to do that. Or reach out to me and I can send you maps for requested areas if you're not wanting to join the SharePoint or you're not wanting to get the layers yourself for a GIS software. So other considerations of constraints and risks, I think frequently do get overlooked a little bit, especially physical hazards and construction risks. So I just wanted to flag up this sort of non-exhaustive list of things to consider, even at the design stage, because it's important to try and consider the risks and constraints in your design so that you can avoid them or otherwise work around them and build them into your plans and your risk assessments, and make sure that contractors are aware of things like utilities or infrastructure, or even in certain areas of the country, unexploded ordnance, which is definitely something that I find people overlook. I know it seems pretty unlikely that you're going to come across unexploded ordnance, but it's not impossible. Even in ploughed fields, occasionally things have been upturned, so it's worth considering the risk, and just making sure that the contractor has a plan and understanding of what to do around that. If you're interested in those sort of things in construction, which should be considered as part of your design, in my opinion, and indeed in the opinion of rules and regulations of the country, then you can have a look at these links here. These are the regulations, so that's CDM. This guidance might be a little bit more accessible. Obviously, it's a lot of it is geared towards big development construction, and it might seem a little bit removed from what we're doing in environmental construction works. But what we are doing is still construction, and it does fall under those regulations, and it's worth bearing in mind. There's also things in there about project management and the records that you have to keep and how to do risk assessments and things like that. Also, if anyone wants an example risk assessment, I'd be very happy to share that. Or if you want to discuss CDM, then yeah, please reach out. Happy to talk about it. This is just a little overview of like some breakdown of those points, just to pick things out in case that's helpful for people. Not exhaustive, obviously, but just some things to consider. I don't know if everyone's aware of line search before you dig, but that's pretty good for letting you know what utilities are in the area. I would say, in my experience, that you can't necessarily trust the maps that you get from the utility companies, especially not initially. If there is anything on site that comes close to your excavations or that you're worried about, I think it's worth reaching out to the relevant utility company and asking them to take a bit of ownership, really, and either reassure you that it's not going to be an issue, or get them to actually come out to site and identify where it is, which they do if they deem it appropriate, because it's in their best interest. yeah, so any other bits to pick out? So yeah, again with infrastructure, I think especially next to like embankments and railways, it's also good to reach out and talk to them about projects if you're doing significant excavation works. Also, I'd mentioned the point about gas lines have sensors all along them. So if you do excavation works sufficiently disturbing near to a gas pipe and it triggers one of their sensors, they will send out a helicopter to see what's happening, and that will cost you money, just for awareness. Yeah, probably a lot of stuff here that everyone is aware of, but just trying to summarize them. So common NFM interventions, this is taken from a guide that Atkins did for Highways England. It seems to be for a project that's no longer working, but you can still get it on the website, and I've shared the link later on. So yeah, the basic, either you're trying to retain overland flows, you can either repurpose existing features or reinstall a ghost pond or renaturalize an element to increase storage by various means, or impeding the flow, so rougher terrain, improvements to vegetation and land use, or increased sinuosity or in-channel features that offer some impediment to the movement of water over the land. Also, soil health is both improvements in soil health can help to store and also to slow the flow. That's pretty comprehensive, I feel. So you've got things like flow spreaders here to take high flows out of the drainage system, storage ponds in corner areas of the field here, gully stuffing in channels that are not permanently flowing in the headlands, some like offline and online storage features around watercourses, and woodland parting, land management, going with the contours here. I think that is supposed to denote, or otherwise swales. And I've just picked out some of the features in there in according to the overarching character there, just for a sort of reference. That I did initially try and go through some of these things with a bit more detail in the presentation, but that would have gone on far too long. So here is the promised list of references. There's some government guides here that include information on where features are appropriate and references to research and assessment reports. But also, this is a bit more technical, the Fluvial Design Guide, but that can be helpful if you're doing in-channel or high-risk features that are going to be dealing with significant flows. There's also some relatively old but good advice on rural sustainable drainage systems, which can be helpful. And the Scottish Environment Protection Agency has a good overall flood management handbook here, which includes some features. Obviously, the River Restoration Centre has a really good manual of techniques, which I'm sure you're aware of. They also have a monitoring one, which is worth looking through. This is where I got that image from on the previous slide. This is and it includes quite a lot of specifications actually for how they should be constructed. So I find that one's very useful. The Syria manuals are great. They've got an NFM one and a SUDS one, and also some for outlets and culverts that can potentially be useful depending on your project. Obviously, there's a cost associated with these ones. So you may potentially not want to invest in them depending on what your needs are, but they are very complete and take you through step by step how to work out the specifications. So if you're doing a lot of projects that require a bit more technical investigation, they might be worth investing in. I do have the NFM manual and the SUDS one, so if anyone wants to have a look through and see if it might be worth it for them, I'd be happy to share. AHDB might be a resource that some of you haven't considered. It's based towards farmers. I've given a link here to the field drainage guide that they have, or guides. There's a few different things there. Obviously, a lot of it won't necessarily be directly relevant, but there is a lot of good information on improving soil health and also practical elements of drainage to consider, which can be very useful. These are some general guides to field buffers. And there's again, these last two elements might not be relevant, but if you are doing projects where you need to consider the risks and to work things out more carefully in an urban environment or according to regulations, then this has some useful information on how you're supposed to do urban drainage and things to consider, including, so it's got even from like scoping and using LiDAR, how to inspect and model and things like that. Really good guidance here to read through if relevant and needed. It's quite a good resource. Oops. And this one, hopefully never needed, but in case you need to do anything that needs to meet the requirements of highways, then that's the place to go to look up how, say, any drainage that cuts across the roadways might need to be designed to meet legal specifications required. That was the bulk of what I was going to go through. I have included some bits here just for interest. I don't know how we're doing for time because I've got my full screen on, sorry.
No, it's okay. Thank you, Ollie. Yeah, we've actually reached time for the meeting.
Sorry.
One or two people had to drop off, unfortunately. But just to, I don't know if you want to continue to round up and then we can go into the chat and maybe expand on some questions or comments that people have made. But much appreciated. Your presentation was really good and not just talking about what to do, but identifying ways to do it. So thank you very much for that. I don't know if you want to use the next minute or so to round up while we go into the chats and questions. You tell me.
That's okay. I'm sorry, my timing is awful, isn't it? I'll share the presentation. So I think people, if they're interested, can have access to that.
Yes, absolutely.
And then, yes, ask me any questions you have, please.
Okay, so I'll just start with a couple of comments that's been on the chat. One from Caroline, who shared a link to the citizen science dashboard, which could also be data that is useful for the river basin. And then one or two people asked if the slides can be shared, which is absolutely correct. It will be after the meeting. People found it helpful. There's some data sources that some people were not even aware of. So thank you very much, Ollie. And then we have a hand raised by Ben earlier. I don't know if, yeah. Hi, Ben.
Hi, Ollie. Good to see you again. Ollie, I might be asking a silly question here, but just based on all of that information is fantastic, and yeah, some new things for me as well, which is great. I'm just thinking about how potentially is there an opportunity for where you've got those priority areas that you showed previously, saying where RFCC would like and flood alleviation focuses in those catchments, all of that work that you've listed there going via the catchment partnerships and kind of like the methodology you've outlined as best practice and what to follow, and from a mapping opportunity point, I just wonder if there is a project in that in itself, a desktop based study to get us all hitting all the right targets within those priority areas from a partnership point of view in a catchment, so that everything is addressed and gone, these are the priorities, these are the recommendations that we would make with regards to NFM, this is how you would do it, this is the permissions you would need. To me, that would be far quicker so that we could then go to the landowner who the opportunity has been identified by, backed by a coordinated approach, and then the delivery of it. I don't know if is that possible? Am I in the right ballpark, or is that completely bonkers?
No, I see where you're coming from. I feel like the catchment partnerships sort of fulfill a lot of that role and do a lot of that work. I suppose the difficulty is if you have a prescribed process, someone needs to take ownership of that. And also it's going to vary quite a lot depending on location and the involvement and the risk of the project. So I wonder if it's even possible to be too prescriptive, but certainly some standardized process within the catchment partnership, perhaps.
Yeah, because it just seems like there's a lot of you just went through all of those links, which are fabulous, but there's no one place. I know Cabo helps with that, and I know no one site is the same. But when it comes to NFM and the application of it, there are some similarities, aren't there? I want to, in order to speed up the process, because a lot of it, and we don't deliver necessarily a huge amount of this, but it going from concept to building a concept to get to detailed design, that's the bit you just covered there. If there was more that was done collectively, I don't want to speak on anyone's behalf, but just from my point of view, then you can get closer to getting to something instead of, because you could go and ground truth the piece of work that's been done. And this is beyond that, this project, and I know you're talking about the question marks over future funding, but getting the catchment smarter, getting us all ready and aligned, from my point of view, would be really helpful. But sorry, I know it's a bit slightly off topic.
I completely agree with you, and I think it's been raised before as well in other LFAs that they'd appreciate some sort of centralized resourcing so that everyone isn't doing the same work over and over again. And yeah, as you say, to facilitate the process. I don't know. I wonder if the RFCC has a role in trying to develop and implement that. I can certainly try and interest them in it, especially as things are changing. They might have some appetite for taking that role. But yeah, I'm not sure really. I think I agree with you. I don't know how it would how to make it happen.
Yeah, no worries. I've seen on some of the chats as well about people saying about the catchment partnerships. I get that completely. It's just more maybe the theme of it. But thanks anyway. Thanks, Ollie, for your time. Really helpful. Thank you.
Right. Not know what I'm talking about either, but just to add to that, if there was some sort of a steering group that RFCC might have, I wonder if they're open to bring people on board from this group that would be able to push that idea forward. I'm not putting it on you, Ollie, but just a thought.
No, I definitely will chat with the TFAs about it. And they do have steering groups. I don't know what the requirements for being in the different ones are, but the catchment partnership should be integrated in that, right?
Okay. I have a question from Hannah Marshall. Yes. Will you share on email the application forms and details? Is there a web page about the fund?
Yes, there absolutely is. I will share that. I'll send around the links with the slides.
Fabulous. I don't know if Hannah's still on the call, if you wanted to expand on that, or she might not be. Brilliant.
Yes, sorry, I am here. I searched, I couldn't find, sorry if I missed something, but I was trying to find, a web page which explained, exactly what the fund were looking for, whether there were certain exclusions and all of that. And I wasn't able to easily find that. So if you're able to send that would be amazing. Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you.
Okay, brilliant. And I've got a question from Angela Gorman. Hands raised, sorry.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. Just to let you know that the Thames RFCC already has an NFM subgroup. I haven't been to one of their meetings for over a year now, but because it's an ongoing topic, I'm pretty sure that subgroup is still going. and it might well be on their webpage as part of their structure, and have contact details there, just so that you're aware of that. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Angela.
I'll include the link for that in what I send around. Thank you.
Great. Are there any more questions for Ollie before we start to round up? Okay, I think we're good. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank